everyone, welcome to Jacob City Fishing's Theology episode. If you are new, please click the subscribe button below and select the option to receive notifications when new episodes are created. Let's jump into some theology. I hope you learn and enjoy. Hey guys, this is part 2 of the law and its influence on the covenant. As you can see, starting us off with the website, just go ahead and take a look there if you need to. Part 1, 2, and 3 will be located here if you could take a look, but I hope you enjoyed part 2. All right, so the next couple are going to get very specific about the law. These are really important and very helpful when you read through the Old Testament law. First off, the law is paradigmatic. Big word, paradigmatic. Old Testament law has a large amount of paradigms. As you can hear, paradigmatic, paradigms, pretty easy. These are a model, a sample, and don't cover every circumstance and demonstrate a pattern through which circumstances need to be filtered. You can see Exodus 21, for example, a law stating you cannot mistreat a servant destroying the eye or tooth. However, what about a broken leg or a finger cut off? The passage doesn't mention any other body parts like an ear or a nose. So is there a loophole in there? According to modern law, like I showed you, and this is something to remember. If you look at modern law, you see very long, drawn out, can't really see it, but very long, drawn out laws about very specific situations. So if you want to learn about drugs, controlled substances like alfentanil, carfentanil, alpha protein, analridine, and many more I can't really pronounce, methadone, levorphenol. I mean, there's so many, but they're specifically mentioned in here. You're not going to find that type of specific in the Old Testament law because they're models, they're paradigms of situations. If something is done without it being precisely described in today's law like that, a loophole can be found and a guilty criminal could go free. However, the Old Testament law was not this way. There were no loopholes. Wisdom must be used according to the law in order to rule judiciously. So, in other words, the law was written in a way where judges had to understand the paradigm behind the law. And if the situation fit that paradigm, you could give a consequence based on it or freedom based on that particular law, even if it wasn't explicitly stated. Now, the Pharisees wouldn't view it specifically as a paradigm. They would view it more as we do today, so they could use loopholes to get away with things. But that's not the intent of the law, nor was it the way that it was supposed to be used. So we have to remember the law was a paradigm, and the Pharisees got into a lot of trouble from Jesus because of what they were doing. And wisdom, I think to highlight that, wisdom was a major part of their lives. It's not, we get so rigid about getting very specific about laws, but we forget that in all actuality, we need wisdom. We've lost this idea of having to even think for ourselves or judges being able to contemplate and think and critically assess situations. Instead, we try to find ways and loopholes in laws to get away with things. That's how lawyers get their clients out of situations, because there are loopholes based off of what the laws state. Because we go by the letter of the law. We try to fix incompetence by having laws that are specific, instead of teaching people how to be competent and critically think and judge judiciously and wisely. We've relied on a written word instead of the ability for people to have character. There are two kinds of Old Testament stipulations that haven't clearly been renewed in the New Testament, or have clearly not, let me put it that way, been renewed in the New Testament: civil laws and ritual laws. Civil laws are specific penalties for various crimes, major and minor, for which one might be arrested and tried in Israel. These laws shaped the daily life of Israel as God's people in their relationship with one another and toward their culture. No one living today is a citizen of ancient Israel. Again, I want to reiterate that. You are not, as a Christian living in Israel, under civil law, the civil law that they were living under. You're not. You didn't agree to that. You're not there. So some considerations when reading those laws are think of them in terms of their role in ancient Israelite society. Think in how they reflect God's character. So we'll get into some examples, but just understand they tell something about God. And if they are paradigms, they tell something about how to think wisely and get people thinking wisely about their environment and circumstances. Now, ritual laws are the largest block of Old Testament laws. They're found in Leviticus along with parts of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They informed the Israelites of how to carry out the practices of Old Covenant worship, detailing everything from the design of the implements of worship to the priest's responsibilities to what sorts of animals should be sacrificed and how they should be sacrificed. So the religious laws, again, we're not under these religious laws, and they are a vast amount of the original laws. There's 601. And so we have to remember that when Jesus's once for all sacrifice was accomplished, the old covenant approach was immediately made obsolete. It's done with. We don't have sacrifices anymore. Jesus was the sacrifice. So it no longer figures in Christian practice, although worship in the new covenant manner continues. So we still worship God, but there are ways in the New Testament that it's discussed for us to worship the Lord versus the way they did it in the Old Testament. We don't have priests. There's one priest, and that's Christ. That's it. So didn't Jesus, though, say not a jot or a tittle, not the least stroke of a pen would ever drop out of the law? No. He's not saying the law itself would be changed. He didn't say this. In Luke 16, Jesus said the law cannot be changed. Jesus came to establish a new covenant outside of the law. And so in so doing, fulfilled the purpose of the old law, the old covenant, thus bringing its time to an end. The fulfillment itself, Jesus called a new command, the law of love. So he fulfilled what the law stated. He was perfect and sinless. He fulfilled it and then was sacrificed in his fulfillment of it. And he rose again and created this law of love that us as believers now and after his resurrection live under. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter of the law to fail. And so it's impossible for the law to fail. It did what it needed to do through Jesus. He then changed the covenant, which then created a new covenant. Now, again, this is where we have examples nowadays, contracts that we create and transitions through contracts that are reflective of this type of transition that took place between the Old Testament and then the Gospels, which is the transitionary period before the new covenant came, which is when he was resurrected. So prior to the resurrection, they were still under the old law, the old covenant. The new covenant came after he rose again, and that's important to understand within the context of the Gospels. The new covenant came after his resurrection, and then we live based off of that. And Jesus foreshadowed a lot of things within the Gospels as to what things were going to be like afterwards, and he also held to account the leadership that was there and present at the time, and how they were sinfully dealing with the law in ways that they shouldn't have been. So in today's labor contracts, a new contract may specify changes in work conditions, different staffing structures, different pay scales, etc. Yet it may also retain certain features of the old contract: seniority, work breaks, provisions against arbitrary firing, etc. To be sure, a labor contract is hardly on the level of the covenant between God and Israel, but it is a type of covenant and therefore helps illustrate in a familiar way the fact that a new covenant can be quite different from an old covenant, yet not necessarily totally different. This is also the case with biblical covenants. So, working in business, for example, if you've ever called a customer service center and you get somebody that's in India, Malaysia, or somewhere else, Those companies are what formally are called managed service providers. A company pays for a service from a managed provider, and that provider does something on behalf of that company because they don't want to have it as a large cost, whatever the case may be. The big company that's the customer pays the other company to do a service so that the big company can save money on whatever issue or service that is. When that contract ends with that managed service provider, a process takes place in order to renegotiate the contract. Much of those contracts with different groups within the organization are going to stay the same. Many will change. Maybe new responsibilities will be given. Maybe they won't. Maybe the responsibilities will diminish and a new company will come in and take over some of those responsibilities. Or maybe that old company an old managed service provider will totally be kicked out and a whole new one will be brought in. However, what will be the same are the expectations, such as their key performance indicators, service level agreements. Those are what the expectations are of that managed service provider. That's what they're going to be held to account. Those are the laws per se between, or the agreements and stipulations and incentives that will be given to that new company that's providing the service for the organization. All of that still happens today. Ethical stipulations. So all that being said, understand that this is not an abnormal transition to take place. God foresaw and stated that he was going to change in prophetic books, the covenant, and that meant there will be structural changes also. So the law, the stipulations, the incentives, all of that stuff is going to change. And I would say that the incentives aspect of it is really important because a lot of people use the incentives like health and wealth to try to portray those things in the New Testament, and it's a lie. It's not part of the stipulations that we receive in the New Covenant. We don't receive those. And so again, understanding the covenant and the law and the stipulations and incentives is very important under the Old Covenant because it's the Old Covenant and we're not under that. To continue the ethical stipulations, so part of the Old Covenant is renewed in the New Covenant, and this is important. There are aspects of the Old Covenant law restored in the New Testament, just like I said, in those contract changes. However, such laws derive their continued applicability from the fact that they serve to support the two basic laws of the New Covenant on which the law and prophets hang. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Everything hangs on those. So those two move into the New Covenant. How that works itself out is different because we're not the nation of Israel. So that means wisdom is a very important part of how to live in the New Testament or under the New Covenant. We have to reflect back in the paradigms of the law and say, hey, these are just paradigms. They're not reflective of who I need to be and how I need to demonstrate my loyalty. But maybe there's something there that, though it's not for me, it's to me, and it shows me something about what God expects and who God is. And now I need to figure out what that is so that I can look ahead and use that as a principle of loving my neighbor. What is that going to look like? Not everything's going to apply. Not everything's going to work. But things like not committing adultery, not having a relationship with your aunt, uncle, mom, brother, sister, whatever the case may be, those are things that are going to apply. Why? Because it's not loving to do those things. So thinking those through are really important. You need wisdom. And again, that's something that, sadly, a lot of pastoral leaders and teachers and professors are not stating. They'd rather have you read a book on how to do certain things and not go and learn how to critically think. The world doesn't want you to critically think. God desires for you to critically think and use his wisdom. He wants you to use his wisdom to love others and love God. So, as I just said, all of the Old Testament law is still the word of God for us, even though it is not still the command of God to us. There are actually passages that are not directly directed toward us personally. There are many that I'll go through with this, or some that I'll go through with this, but I always say this, people talk about wanting to date unbelievers, or they don't even know if the person's a believer, or they're young. They don't even know how to identify if the individual is a young believer, mature believer, or not. And they'll just say, well, God told me this. And they'll point to some passage in scripture that typically has nothing to do with it at all. And so I reflect back to them, well, what if I wanted to use the Benjamites as an example, and how they sinned, and they needed to find wives. So because of the consequences of judgment that were put on them. So what they do is they go to a party and they just grab some women and they take them, and now they're their wives. What if I use that as an example of what I need to do? And I need to just go find a party, grab a woman, take her, she's going to be my wife now. You'd be like, you're crazy. You're nuts. Like, that is that's kidnapping. There's so many things that are wrong with that. Well, I wouldn't use those passages as words of wisdom, considering the circumstances are totally different between my dating life and my life and the circumstances now under the new covenant versus back then and what was going on. And so I ask you to get to know how to actually study scripture, use the book, get to know hermeneutics and exegesis in a biblical sense, not eisegesis, implanting your own thoughts or desires or bad stomach aches and because of bad pizza onto the text, and your feelings about everything just to reinterpret the text. Not that the text doesn't mean what everybody wants it to mean. The authors actually had an intent. It might behoove those that are reading it and studying it or professing to be Christian to actually get to know what their intent is instead of making it up for themselves. Another example, we are not concerned about parapets around the roof of our houses in Deuteronomy 22. But we should delight in the God who cares that house guests not fall off of usually flat roof, which they were unfamiliar. So they had to be taught to love their neighbors in this way. So think about this. Israel's traveling from Egypt into the promised land. They don't have homes. And they might not even be familiar with parapets. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know if Egypt had the types of flat roof houses where you can climb up and you can stand on the roof. I think they did, but I could be wrong. Either way, they didn't live in those houses when they traveled. And so they needed to start thinking, man, if we build houses, we need to put safeguards around the houses in order for us to keep people safe and not get hurt falling off the roof. And a parallel to this would be like a pool. If you live in Arizona, you're required to have a fence around the pool because children die from drowning often because there's not fences around the pools. The same parallel takes place here with parapets. We need to have these walls around the roof so that people don't fall off and get hurt or die because we didn't have the protections up. We need to love our neighbors by protecting them and doing things around our home when we're building homes or living in a home to protect people that are visiting or living there. We can't know the significance of our story now without knowing the law then and how it functioned and how God taught them to relate with one another, lovingly think through why and how they can love others through things like their home, their work, their jobs, like dealing with the poor in their fields, like all of this stuff. We need to really consider what those things look like, what it meant to have wisdom, loving wisdom in that time. Lastly, explicit renewals. Only that which is explicitly renewed from the Old Testament law can be considered part of the New Testament law of Christ. So as I talked about, there is the law of Christ, and things such as the 10 Commandments are transferred into the new covenant. Also included are obviously the 2 great commandments over top of those 10 commandments. And these perfectly display God's character, which is to be reproduced in his children. So loving God, loving neighbor should continually be reproduced in believers. No other specific Old Testament laws can be demonstrated to be binding on Christians, valuable as it is for Christians to know all of the laws. We should actually value and enjoy reading the law. And Until we really have, and it's true for me, until I really had an understanding of how this framework looked, it was difficult and tedious reading those laws. Now I see them and I'm like, okay, what is the paradigm that this law is trying to get across? And that helps me substantially in understanding what those laws mean, how they impacted them, and how they should look at them socially. And then, does that type of paradigm fit us today in any regard? 3, the role of the law in Israel and in the Bible. Again, like I said, how should Christians relate to the law? How did Israel relate to the law? The law, when it was given, was not thought of as a means of salvation. It was not given for this reason, nor was it intended to do so. God already saved them from Egypt. They didn't need to be saved. They needed to know the stipulations of the law in the covenant. The law established loyalty between God and his people. The law simply represented the terms of the agreement of loyalty that Israel had with God. The law is not a complete list of things one could or should do to please God in ancient Israel. It represents rather examples or samples of what it means to be loyal to God. Again, they're paradigms of how people should have thought of how to love God and love others, particularly love God. God also provided a means of forgiveness and atonement through the law. So this is where it gets real interesting. He knew they would sin, so he added those ritual laws there. For us, we know we'll sin, but we already have the sacrifice. So there are stipulations that are stated in how to handle things if we sin or we see others sin. If we see leaders in the church sin, there are things that we should be doing that are stipulations in Scripture, part of the covenant. Let's see, God also provided a means of forgiveness and atonement through the law. Israel's problem in the Old Testament was not in their inability to keep the law. They could fully keep the law. It was with their choosing not to do so. They chose to rebel and be disloyal. And that Isaiah clearly saw this, and that people become like the gods they worship. Hence, Israel is described as having eyes but not seeing, and having ears but not hearing. Just like the idols they were attracted to and finally worshiped. They denied and rejected the law, the covenant that God clearly gave to them, along with all of the reminders that he gave them in the holidays and the events and the things that they were to do to remember and recall what God had done. And they went to these mute, man-made idols and became just like them. Instead of becoming Yahweh's people, a people who exemplified his character of justice and mercy, caring for the needy in the land, etc., they were full of greed, capricious, sexually immoral, and they were like the Baals of the Canaanites. All right, with that said, there were 2 kinds of Old Covenant, Old Testament stipulations. In order to help with your reading of the laws, it should prove useful for you to understand the 2 basic forms in which they're given: apodictic laws, casuistic laws. Apodictic laws, or apodictic, means all purpose. So they're commands that begin with do or do not, and these types of laws are called apodictic. They're direct commands, usually in the second person imperative, so they're commands. Imperative means command. Generally applicable, telling the Israelites the sorts of things they are supposed to do to fulfill their part of the covenant with God. These are not exhaustive. Again, they're not exhaustive. They're paradigms. The law is paradigmatic. It sets a standard by an example rather than by mentioning every possible circumstance. The statements in the law were intended as a reliable guide with general applicability, not a technical description of all possible conditions one could imagine. It's a sample, it's a model, it's a guide. Casuistic or casuistic, or however you pronounce it, law are the case-by-case ones, dealing with case-by-case laws dealing with specific circumstances. So though they're specific, they're still paradigms. The elements the elements like this are conditional. In other words, they have if-then statements. They describe certain conditions that may prevail in certain types of situations involving certain types of people, but not necessarily in every situation involving every person. Casuistic laws, usually involving third-person descriptions, give examples of what, so they're written in the third person, and they give examples of what may be the case or what may happen and what ought to be done if it does. In contrast to apodictic laws, which prescribe what must always be done by everyone in all situations, casuistic laws single out particular cases that apply only to some people in some situations, not to everyone in all situations. The recipients of the laws were expected to understand that there were broader implications. So apodictic, they dealt with everybody. Casuistic deal with specific situations and people that qualify for those specific situations and what to do with them. This is a large portion of the 601 commandments found in the Pentateuch Law. None of these are explicitly found in the New Covenant. Because, and again, I'm going to state that again, none of them are explicitly stated in the New Testament. Because such laws apply specifically to Israel's civil, religious, and ethical life, they are by their very nature limited in their applicability and therefore unlikely to apply to the Christian. So let's do some examples, right? Apodictic law, Leviticus 19, 9 through 14. Now, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And remember parts of that covenant. I am the Lord your God, right? He's announcing his role there. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you until nightfall, or until morning. Sorry. Now all night, they're not to remain with you until all night, until morning. You shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. Notice first by the three times repeated, I am the Lord, how clearly tied to Yahweh's own character these laws are. The Israelite as God's people were to worship and thus be like their God. Then that demonstrated loyalty. He announces his role and authority in that law and then requires them to represent him in those ways, reflect him, right? Like an ambassador, like we're called to be. Such commandments as these, therefore, were binding on all Israelites at all times. These laws were not exhaustive. Note that only field crops, wheat, barley, etc., and grapes are actually mentioned. Does this mean that if you raised sheep or harvested figs or olives, you were under no obligation to share your abundance with the poor and resident foreigner? Would others bear the burden of making the Old Testament divinely commanded welfare system while you got off scot-free? Of course not. So basically, if I went by the letter of the law, anybody outside of these fields of work would be excluded from having to provide for the poor and the needy and the foreigner, the non-citizen of Israel. That wouldn't be right. The idea here is that it's paradigmatic. It's a paradigm for all people to provide in these ways to the poor and the foreigner. The law is paradigmatic as it sets a standard by an example rather than by mentioning every possible circumstance. But at the same time, it is also universally applicable to all those who own land and raise cattle or crops. Consider the final two commands, 13b and 14. The point of these statements is to prohibit holding up payment to day workers and abusing people with disabilities. What if you withheld payment to a worker almost all night, but then gave it to him just before dawn? The teachers of the law and the Pharisees of Jesus' day might have argued that your actions were justified since the law plainly says overnight. But narrow, selfish legalism of this sort, in fact, is a distortion of the law. The statements in the law were intended as a reliable guide with general applicability, not a technical description of all possible conditions one could imagine. Likewise, if you harmed a person who is mute or one who is lame or has mental disabilities, would you still have kept the final command in the list? You shall not curse a deaf man nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. Certainly not. The deaf and the blind are merely selected examples, i.e. the ear and the eye, thus sight and sound, of all persons whose physical weaknesses demand that they be respected and aided rather than disregarded or despised. So again, it's great examples of how we should view these laws as paradigms, right? In conclusion of apodictic law, we make here a preliminary hermeneutical observation. Although not its primary intent, the law shows us how impossible it is to please God on our own. Yes, in reality, what this really shows us is we don't have everything written down in the law in the Old Testament to deal with every circumstance. We don't have the wisdom or guidance to do that, nor can we fulfill everything then. This, of course, is not how it's not a new observation to understand that we can't please God on our own through the law. Paul said a similar thing in his letter to Rome in Romans 3:20, but the point is applicable for readers of the law, not just theological truth. When we read the Old Testament law, we ought to be humbled to appreciate how unworthy we are to belong to God. We ought to be moved to praise and thanksgiving that he provided for us a way to be accepted in his sight apart from humanly fulfilling the Old Testament law. For otherwise, we'd have no hope at all of pleasing God. We'd be stuck having to give those sacrifices, and the Old Testament law we'd be joining in with Israel, and we'd have to follow those laws through him. But luckily, we don't have to do that. Christ came, he was the sacrifice, and now we're free from that. In contrast to the apodictic laws, casuistic laws, here's an example of a casuistic law. Deuteronomy 15:12-17. If your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, then he shall serve you 6 years. But in the 7th year, you shall set him free. When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your wine vat. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt and that the Lord your God redeemed you. Again, going back to that covenant, right? This user in covenant. Remember where you came from. God saved you. That should impact how you save or work with others. Therefore, I command you this today. It shall come about if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you. Then you shall take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also, you shall do likewise to your maidservant. This text only applies, one, when you are an Israelite, and you have at least one servant. So there are stipulations with this law, because you have to have a servant, a slave, and you have to be an Israelite. Two, as an Israelite, you have a servant who does not wish to remain with you as a servant voluntarily after the mandatory minimum term of service is passed. So either this slave wants to or does not want to stay with you at some point. And you're at that point now if you're looking at this law. What do you do? If you're not an Israelite or don't have servants, the law doesn't apply to you because the stipulations don't fit your circumstance. If you yourself are a servant, this law, because it's directed to your boss, applies to you indirectly only, in that it protects your rights. But the law does not pertain to everyone. It's conditional based on a long-term special labor contract, somewhat like a multi-year military enlistment in modern times. A possible condition that may or may not apply to a given person at a given time. Specific type of slave, specific type of person who is an Israelite and has a slave, and there's specific agreements about the time frame in which that individual will be working for the Israelite. Those are the conditions. What we can still learn. Although we personally might not have servants, we can see that God's provision for long-term service under the Old Covenant was hardly a brutal, harsh regulation. We could scarcely justify the sort of slavery practiced in most of the world's history, including American history, for example, from such a law. You look at the 1800s in America and you don't see an ability for them to be free and choose whether or not to stay as a servant or not. Letting servants go free after only 6 years of service and with enough resources to start a new life provided a major limitation on the practice of contractual servitude, so that the practice could not be abused beyond reasonable limits. Note especially how this law is related to Israel's own history. As redeemed slaves out of Egypt, who once had no hope of earning their freedom, they are to show mercy to those who find it necessary to become servants among their own people. So they left Egypt and they were given gold and all these resources when they left. If they have a servant or slave that is leaving, it's their time allotment is up. They are to give to them what they need to survive when they leave. Second, we learn that God loves both servants and slaves. His love is seen in the stringent safeguards built into the law, as well as in the final set in verses 14 and 15, which demand generosity toward the servants, inasmuch as their God had shown such generosity towards Israel, God's own people, a group of former slaves. Third, we learn that long-term service could be practiced in such a benign fashion that servants were actually better off being in service than being free. That is, the servant's boss, by assuming the obligation to provide food, clothing, and housing for servants, was in many cases keeping them alive and well. On their own, they could die of starvation or perhaps exposure if they lacked the resources to survive in the harsh economic conditions that prevailed in ancient Palestine. So their lifestyle could be substantially better as a slave than free. And they got to choose whether they wanted to be or not. Fourth, the servant's boss did not really own the servant in a total sense. He owned the servant contractually, subject to a host of restrictions spelled out or alluded to in a number of other laws on service. His power over the servant was not absolute under the law. God was the owner of both the boss and the servant. God had redeemed or bought back all the Hebrews, as the gentle reminder at the end of the verse 15 had stated, and had owner's claim on all of them, servant or free. So God owns everybody that was saved from Egypt and their children and so on. And thinking about it in this way, when we think of generations later held to account for what had happened to the initial generation that was saved, we see there was an agreement that transferred through that agreement, initial agreement, to their children's 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 children, etc. And so there is this understanding that God owned and was responsible for both the owner and the servant / slave. In conclusion, it doesn't matter that the law code of this Deuteronomy 15 is not a command directly to us or about us. What matters is how much we can learn from this law about God, his demands of fairness, his ideals for the Israelite society, and his relationship to his people, especially as regards the meaning of redemption. This law then provides us with an important part of the background for the New Testament teaching on redemption. 2, a clearer picture of how Old Testament servitude was quite different from what most modern people usually think of as slavery. 3, a perspective on the love of God that we may not otherwise have had. And 4, these were laws applied to those who met the qualifications. So again, when somebody ignorantly comes to you and starts talking about slavery being valued in the Old Testament, if you don't have an understanding of how that worked itself out and the type of environment it was and the difference between that type of slavery and the slavery of the 1800s, let alone in other countries in the 1800s, but at least for us, scriptural understanding of slavery at the time, it can be very difficult to have those conversations legitimately. But when we understand how that relationship worked between the owner and the slave, and the freedoms that came with that, and the rules and the opportunities that were there for people to be free, it makes it very challenging to have the conversations. And if we do know those things, then we can have a good dialogue and bring truth to those circumstances. So again, understanding these things is so important. Understanding the covenant and the laws and the incentives is just extremely important when having those discussions. This legal passage, in other words, is still the word of God for us, though it's obviously not a command from God to us. As a side note, not everything, however, about servants in ancient Israel can be learned from this law. Certain rules for servants of foreign origin are different in scope. So if it's a foreigner, there are rules that pertain to them differently than those that were Israelites that were slaves. All the laws in the Pentateuch regarding slavery still only touch the surface. It should be obvious that a few hundred laws only function in a paradigmatic way, that is, as examples of how people should behave, not an exhaustive list.